I'm very happy to have this chance to talk about my new biography of King Henry III. It was published by Yale last summer, and I suppose not a very propitious time. A small thing, of course, when people are dying and losing their jobs, but not a propitious time for a book to be published. Still, it has gone into a reprint, and there's a curious difference between the two versions. But here's the first version here, but there were some complaints that the pages were rather thin, the paper's rather thin, so Yale reacted to that, and the second version published it on larger paper. So as you can see from this, the second version is a good deal fatter. So I think it's better placed to withstand the ravages of time, but also is going to take up a larger part of your shelves. Perhaps I could, though, at the start, thank Yale very much, I think, for the beautiful way they produced the book, and for the decision, I think, to put the first time in the English Monarchs series to put the illustrations in colour, which I think has greatly enhanced, in a way, the appearance and the impact of the book. So there's some lovely pictures here in colour. Now, in this obviously learned audience, I don't need to start by saying who Henry III was and so on, but I will. And here, on occasion, I shall go in and out of some images. So let's have a few images to start with. So, as you all know, Henry III was the son of King John. He was 9 when he came to the throne in 1216, 65 when he died in 1272, one of the longest, obviously the longest medieval reign. Here he is, a small boy, being crowned by Archbishop Langton at the start of his reign. Here he is on his tomb in Westminster Abbey at the end of it. And here's another view of the tomb in a service actually on the 800th anniversary of Henry's birth. And you can see the tomb there on the left. Now, in that long reign, there was a transformation, I think, in the political, religious, social life of the kingdom. Politically, again, obviously, as you all know, the period sees the establishment of Magna Carta, and their familiar image is the very first reference to Magna Carta in a proclamation of the king in 1218, or proclamation of the minority government. And here's the final definitive version of Magna Carta, with the splendid seal of Henry III beneath it, issued in 1225. And the blodging, I think, is because the archivist at Durham at some point spilt ink all over it. The reign, too, saw the real beginnings of Parliament, the beginnings of parliamentary power, and some of the early parliaments met in this wonderful building, the Chapter House of Westminster Abbey. It's a revival of queenship too, and here is Eleanor of Provence, Henry's queen, on a wonderful head in the what was probably the royal pew, now the muniment room of Westminster Abbey. Long period of peace in Henry's reign, which saw a new commercial network of markets and fairs, huge expansion of the money supply. There's my own small collection of Henry III silver pennies. One of those, incidentally, is about enough to buy your food for a day, bread and ale. And they're very readily available on eBay, and where I got most of them from. And it compares to my colleague at King's, Stephen Baxter, years ago, had one pathetic Anglo-Saxon coin. And although he always said the design was much better than these mass-produced coins of Henry III, but you know, the Henry III ones compared to Anglo-Saxon coins, because of the gigantic expansion of the money supply, are much more available. Religious life of the country obviously was transformed by the arrival of the friars, the work of pastoral bishops, and building of so many great churches. Here's Salisbury. All of that, save the top of the tower and the spire, was built in the reign of Henry III between 1220 and 1258. And of course, Henry himself built Westminster Abbey. Long period domestic peace, and that was linked to an absence of foreign war. So total contrast to before and afterwards. England, Henry lived in peace with the kings of Scotland, and in the end made peace with the King of France, and of course in the Treaty of Paris resigned his claims to the continental dominions lost by his predecessors. Here's Louis IX's own ratification of the Treaty of Paris in the National Archives at Kew. Here's Henry III's ratification, I'm afraid to say rather better kept in the Archive, or survived rather better, in the Archive Nationale in Paris. And here's the ratification of the Council of 15 alongside it. Well, I suppose if all those are good things, there were other developments in Henry's reign which I suppose were not, quotes, good. There was the great rise in the population, probably left many peasants living on the edge of subsistence and starving to death in years of bad harvest. And 1258, of course, the year of great political revolution in England, was also a year of starvation. The Jews, Henry's reign saw a escalation in the persecution of the Jews. Henry's taxation broke their financial back, and he was the first king of England to sanction the terrible belief, obviously totally distorted, wrong belief, that Jews captured little Christian boys and crucified them in the macabre parody of the crucifixion of Christ. And of course, that led to terrible events at Lincoln in 1255. And the end of the reign, Henry's peace, of course, concluded in a vicious civil war. And here is the familiar image of Simon de Montfort's body being cut up at the Battle of Evesham. Now, central to all these events was Henry himself, his impact on everything, really. And I tried to make Henry himself central to the biography, his personality, his policies, his outlook. So I will stop or go back on full screen now, if you can bear it. How did I come to write the biography of Henry? And why does it take the form it does, which is largely, although Henry's personality is weaved throughout, it's largely a narrative account of the reign. Well, when I was thinking of how to start, I was reminded of a discussion between John Betjeman and Philip Larkin, which you can all see on YouTube. And Betjeman asks Larkin, well, what do you make of all this criticism sometimes made of your poetry? You know, that you're a miserable old sod, writing provincial sub-welfare state poetry. And Larkin says, well, of course, what the critics don't really realize is, well, I rather agree. But like everyone else, I'm the product of my personality, upbringing, environment. And so one doesn't choose what one writes what one has to write and can write. Now, I don't think I would endorse criticisms necessarily made of biography as a branch of history. But I certainly would agree, well, everyone would agree with Larkin's statement that one writes what one's personality, upbringing, as a case of historian training, leads one to write. And I thought I'd start there. I ought to start there with my degree, a degree in Oxford in the late 1960s. And the central part of the degree, indeed, I think the only compulsory papers were what were called then English 1, English 2, and English 3, which covered the history of England from the departure of the Romans all the way through to, quotes, modern times. And I think there was still a feeling that the central part of the degree was the medieval section of it. And I think I must have done about 20 essays on the period of English history from 400 to 1400. The degree was still criticized then, as being, you know, still tinged by Stubbs's constitutional history, which you can see behind me there, the three volumes of it, and that it was fundamentally political, constitutional history, development, tracing the development of the English state. I think that not quite true. It was a bit unfair in that, say, an essay on the Norman conquest would be very much influenced by Maitland, an essay on changes in the structure of society from the peasantry upwards. If we take 1215 Magna Carta, I mean, the book which I think I most admired, influenced me most, I still place it right at the top of the books I admire, was J.C. Holt's The Northerners. And I think the narrative part of that and the narrative part of his subsequent Magna Carta is not really the strength of the book. Holt wasn't much interested in narrative, really. I don't think it was very good writing it. And certainly his account of 1215, I think, is simply plain wrong. But the great strength of the Northerners was really the analysis of local society, Northern society, with the chapters on the Northern Barons, the Northern Knights, and the ties of faction, and then a study of how government pressed upon it, chapters like the loss of Normandy and its consequences. And I think the Northerners really did influence my own thesis, which was a study of government and local society in Oxfordshire in the late 12th, first part of the 13th century, supervised, like Holt's thesis, by John Prestwich, although I certainly wouldn't in any way put my thesis in the category of Holt's. So when I finished the thesis, I always remember somewhat discouragingly one of the examiners saying, well, as I say, it was a study of government and society in Oxfordshire, that it wasn't publishable as a book, which I think was probably quite true, but that it might make one or two articles in Oxoniensis, which was the local Oxfordshire journal. Well, at least I was more ambitious than that, and it did lead to two articles, I think I could say major articles, in English Historical Review, one on sheriffs, local government, the demands of the Exchequer, the other on the fortunes of the knightly class in the 13th century. And after I'd done that, I suppose, my work could have gone in different ways. I remember Michael Prestwich saying to me after the sheriff's article came out, you're going to pursue that across the later Middle Ages, which is a very interesting thing to have done. Equally, of course, I could have been followed in the footsteps of Peter Coss and written much more about the gentry. But the thesis also did introduce you to the world of kingship and high politics, because many of the sheriffs of Oxfordshire I studied were great ministers of the crown. And the thesis led to an article, for example, on the fall of Hubert de Burgh, an article I may say I had great difficulty getting published. I sometimes think the trajectory of an academic career is reflected in success or failure in getting articles accepted by periodicals. So when I started off, I found it quite difficult to get articles published. And then there came a time when even past and present asked me to write an article about peasants in politics, asked me to write an article for it. And now I think probably I'm coming into decline again with age. Certainly the last article I published in English Historical Review on the Pershore Chronicle in the mid-13th century only just squeaked in with considerable reservations from its readers. Anyway, sorry. So the thesis did have a window into politics, into kings and things. And so around late 1970s, around 1980, I did begin to think, well, no one else seems to be doing it. Could I write the biography of Henry III in the English Monarchs series, had been with Aaron Spottis, but then with Methuen? And there was context there because Warren had brought out his biography of Henry II in 1974, following on his John. And I knew that Michael Prestwich was writing the biography of Edward I in the English Monarchs series. So I got in touch with Methuen, and they sent me down to the editor of the series, David Douglas, obviously biography of William the Conqueror, in Bristol, being a professor in Bristol, and we had a chat, and it went from there. And very soon Douglas said yes, and very soon I had a contract with Yale to write Methuen to write the book. Now, I think in approaching the research, I didn't have any great plan or great vision. I mean, it just seemed to me obvious that the point of a biography was to tell of a king, was to tell the story of the role of the king in the politics of the age. Not, I hoped, in any boring narrative way, but, you know, very much concerned with the why and the wherefore around it, if you like, a thickened political narrative. And also, obviously, to understand bring the king alive, to understand his outlook, way of life, how he thought about things. And I think and obviously to do that in a narrative way. And I suppose my approach was also reflected in the way I did the research, because the first thing I did was to read through all the chancery rolls of the reign from the 1216 to 1272. And of course, that was made easier by the fact that they were in print. And here I should put a salute to, you know, the great editors of the last century who produced these. Here's the close rolls of 1234 to 1237, produced these great works, which, you know, it would be almost impossible to have done the book without the close rolls. And it's nice that, of course, the close rolls in particular are Latin all the way through, some with splendid indexes. Incidentally, indexes are far better in the 1230s than they became later. So I read through all the chancery rolls, and I put every piece of what I thought interesting information on a new bit of paper, and then arranged them all chronologically. And equally, I obviously interleaved into that the material from all the great chroniclers of the reign, particularly Matthew Paris. And so I did this year by year. Here's the file for 1256, and you can see how big it is. And you say every one of these pages is something from the chancery rolls or from the chroniclers, and so on. So I ended up with quite literally 56 of these. Looking at them all now, serried ranks over there in a different bookcase. And at the same time, as I went through, I had a thematic file for each year. You know, the king and the household, chancery, religion, and I also built up patronage files. So every year, it took about a year building up files of all the patronage the king was distributing. And alongside that, and of course, this was then I looked at all the read through all unprinted material for the reign, which was then, of course, in the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane. And I thought the reading through the heir rolls was particularly important, because I then first got the impression how weak Henry's government was in the localities, allowing all these great nobles to withdraw their men from attendance to the county court, defying the power of the sheriffs. And equally, I went through all the pipe rolls, really following on from Holt to see whether 1258, the great revolution against Henry, was a rebellion of the king's debtors, and coming to the conclusion it certainly wasn't, because Henry was extremely lax in collecting the debts of his great men. And that fitted in also with the pipe rolls, which were fine rolls, which were not published then. And of course, subsequently, that was the last part of the Chancery Rolls of Henry III to be published by the Fine Rolls Project. But the Fine Rolls had all these writs from the king stopping the collection of debts of people in his favour. And memoranda rolls of the Exchequer also important to have read through, and I read through all of those. So having done all that, and it was about 1986-7, I started to actually write what I thought was the biography of the king for Methuen. And I wrote and wrote. And in the end, after about a couple of years, I discovered that what I'd written was a book. It was so long, it was already just a book by itself on the minority of Henry III. And when I informed Methuen of this, the editor of the English Monarchs series, then Anne Mansbridge, took a big gulp, but had it read by quite a lot of people and said, yes, we'll publish it as a separate book. And there, of course, it is, The Minority of Henry III. And that, of course, led to, I always thought, the rather good joke of Christopher Harper Bill, who said, thinking, well, golly, how many more volumes will there be before you get to the end of the reign, thinking that in future, when people want a short account of the reign of Henry III, they will turn to Powick. Anyway, so this is 1990. And if someone had told me in 1990 that it would be another 30 years before the biography of Henry III appeared, I would have been astonished, and I would just not have believed them. I assumed it would come out in the next few years. But of course it didn't. This raises a whole series of obvious questions. One of them, I think the starting point there is something Michael Clancy said to me, because Michael Clancy read the book for Yale and said some very nice and positive things about it. But he also, beside that, sent me an email saying he particularly admired this sort of way I sustained commitment and interest for so long and managed to sort of keep going. And I suppose that raised a series of questions. Obviously, many people, several of the people actually contracted to write the English Monarchs volumes never actually produced them, and other people were brought in instead. So, you know, what might have happened? What was Michael thinking about? Well, I suppose I might just have had writer's block, and in the end, just thought it's too big a book. I just can't write it, and I preferred to write a series of articles. Obviously, I did write a series of articles about the reign. I think another might have been, you know, one just lost faith in doing a historical biography. You know, it was a period when so many, you know, it was rather old-fashioned, so many other new approaches, ways of doing history were appearing between the 1980s and today. Or I might just have wanted to actually do something a bit different. I mean, Larkin said one doesn't choose what one writes, but it's not entirely true. Clearly, quite a lot of historians have actually shifted their areas of interest quite substantially. Richard Vaughan obviously began with this wonderful book about Matthew Paris, definitive book in ways still, and then wrote about ducal Burgundy, or more dramatically still, Ian Kershaw begins with Bolton Abbey in the medieval period, past and present article on the great famine of 1315-16, and then goes off to find fame, fortune, and knighthood by writing about Hitler. In a way, Michael Clancy was the same, because, you know, in 1968 he brought out in History an article, Did Henry III Have a Policy? Really the first new thinking since Powick. And, you know, there's a lot of kings and things in England and its rulers. So I'm sure if Michael had been asked in the 1970s, you know, do you want to write the biography of Henry III in the English Monarchs series? If Michael had wanted to do that, I think Methuen would have bit his hand off and said, yes, please do. But of course, Michael decided he didn't want to do anything like that. And symbolically, he actually handed over, I think, a draft copy of the Did Henry III Have a Policy to me, which had rather more in it than the eventual published version, sort of symbolically indicating he wasn't what, you know, go ahead, you try and do it, but I don't want to do it. And of course, the rest is in a way history. And he went on to write, and I've got I think we go back to the screen share, an image of it here. He went back to write, obviously, wonderful memory to, here we go, Memory to Written Record. And here is Michael in the West, in the old Rolls Chapel in our now library at King's, holding the third edition of Memory to Written Record, and then obviously book on Abelard and all kinds of things. But so, you know, Michael consciously decided he did not want to go on, if you like, with kingship and political history. So why didn't the same thing happen to me? I can honestly say that I actually never, ever occurred to me to give up over these 30 years writing Henry III. And it never occurred to me I wouldn't in the end write it. I think there was an element of personality there. It's difficult one to talk about one's own personality, but although I've always been on the left politically, and indeed I've always been a paid up member of the Labour Party, I'm also quite conservative in some ways, almost blinkered and conventional in a way. My children and wife despair of the way I always want to revisit the same cathedrals and castles. So, you know, I'm probably the ideal person from that point of view to stick to what I was doing. And, you know, I was strengthened in that by my special subject at King's, which for over 20 years was about the reign of Henry III. It never occurred to me not to go on with it. And, you know, every year the students, I think, who were doing it had new ideas, and it was inspiring. I was inspired and sustained by them. Also, and I think this now comes to the heart of why I kept going, I was inspired by the source material. And with respect to Matthew Paris, at the heart of that source material, I do think, again, are the Chancery Rolls. I mean, you know, these are quite amazing in the detail in which they record the output. Remember, the Chancery issues all the King's letters, charters, and so on. And then, not all that many of them survive. But of course, what does survive is the record of that on these extraordinary Chancery Rolls, in which, you know, not all by any means, but a high proportion of the letters Henry's issuing every day, every year, every day are recorded. And here is an example of an unfurled Chancery Roll, which is unfurled when the MA students doing the MA in medieval history at King's on a visit to the National Archives at Kew a few years ago. Well, you know, if we went into that in detail, what it is, a whole record, extraordinary record of these of the King's letters. I'll just go out of this for a second. Obviously, very few originals survive, but over the years I have actually got a small collection of originals of Henry's letters. Here is one, and this is in a way a bog standard administrative letter, which very few survive, and it's an order right at the start of the reign to the men of the Peak to be obey William de Ferrers, Earl of Derby. It's actually a letter patent because it's an announcement to them, but it looks much more like a sort of letter close, the sort of bog standard administrative letter. At the top of the range, of course, are charters. And here, if I reach over, is a charter of King Henry III from 1246, a lovely silken cord on it. And there's Henry, a bit of him sitting on his throne. And if we turn it over, you can see a bit of him on his horse, and I'll just open it for you, and you'll see, well, you all know what these look like, but incidentally, my little collection inspired very different comments from friends and colleagues, in that David Crook of the Public Record Office National Archives, so here's the whole charter of 1246, wonderful witness list at the end with Simon de Montfort there and everything, and there's the seal. Anyway, so David Crook said, oh, golly, you make quite sure you're keeping it in proper conditions, and I hope I am. Whereas Christopher Dyer, I think in jest, was horrified and said, you know, for heaven's sake, stop, because it'll get around and people will start stealing documents to feed your thirst from them. Anyway, as I said, I think the Chancery Rolls and the letters on them are absolutely central to any biography of Henry III. And I think we can't go into this, but you know, I think they provide a unique source in a way they don't for the later Middle Ages, or indeed earlier, except intermittently for John's reign, in that it's possible, I think, first of all, it's absolutely possible to trace in really day-to-day detail the course of politics in the reign. And that's why, you know, a biography of Henry III can do things which you can't do. I mean, here's Le Goff's St. Louis, but whereas it would have been possible to write a Henry III rather like Le Goff's St. Louis, you couldn't have written Le Goff's St. Louis like my Henry III, because there just isn't the same day-to-day information. I think the other thing about the Chancery Rolls is that they do bring the king alive, his personality, his outlook, in quite an extraordinary way. And I think I have claimed, I think I try and sustain it, that you can get closer to Henry III on a day-to-day basis than any other medieval king. I think it was Colvin who first realized that in talking about Henry in the building, and the you know, this sort of amazing orders, get that finished, get the new chamber at Westminster finished. By the time I arrive, even if 1,000 workmen have to labor night and day, or get this finished, whatever the cost, even if you have to borrow the money, and you get a real sense of the expansive personality of the king. So how does Henry come across? I think as open-handed, profligate, angry sometimes, but easily appeased, uxorious, hence the space for Eleanor of Provence, pacific, lazy, but also in a way ambitious, obviously a connoisseur of art and architecture, sense of humor. Remember slapdash in some ways. Remember when he went to Bath, he had his jester thrown into the Roman bath there. Simplex, of course, meaning I think naive, and also, of course, deeply pious. And reputation as a Rex Christianissimus is absolutely sustained if we look at the records of the reign. And of course, that then takes us into Edward the Confessor as his patron saint and the building of Westminster Abbey. I think that personality impacts on so much of the reign, on the patronage, creating those factional stripes at court, which naively he can't control, the Sicilian project, the long periods of peace, Rex Pacificus, and how his government, in some ways, he was very suitable from post-Magna Carta kingship. His government has none of the aggressive drive of John, the government of John, or indeed of sometimes Edward the First. And so I just found tracing what was happening almost day to day and trying to weave Henry's personality. Well, you didn't really want to weave it because it created what happened day to day, was so fascinating. And so when, having written bits and pieces of it over 25 years, from 1990 through to 2015, golly, that's actually a quarter of a century. When at the end of the Magna Carta year in 2016, I sat down to actually start to write and rewrite it, because I wanted to be so coherent and not to be bitty. So I started to rewrite it from the start in 2016. I didn't really have any difficulty about it over the next 3 years. I wrote it all the way through from the beginning to the end, 1272. And then that's where I'm very grateful to Heather McCallum at Yale, because she took the very difficult decision that, yes, we should publish it in 2 volumes. And of course, it's the first volume down to the Great Revolution of Henry VIII, which came out in May. Now, I think the centrality of the king himself to the book, which obviously be rather less so in the second volume, which is, Simon de Montfort is often central to it. The centrality of Henry himself to this first phase of the book, and I think he's central even in the aftermath of the minority under Hubert de Burgh and Peter de Roche in a way. But the centrality of Henry, and obviously this has got his whole of his personal rule from 1234 to 1258, I think does explain some of the features of the book, in that I don't make an attempt to sort of give a general history of, say, Ireland or Gascony, no general history of the king's dominions, and really they come in when Henry himself is directly involved. And there that would be different from other volumes in the Yale series. I'm thinking of Chris Gibbon Wilson's book, I Much Admire Henry IV, which does cover Ireland, Gascony in much more detail. I often like the way Chris Gibbon Wilson writes, and that Henry IV had perfected the art of falling and falling without quite hitting the ground. And as I've said to Chris, you could say the same about Henry III. Talking about the other volumes of the English Monarchs series, perhaps it just gives me a chance to give a salute to someone who died earlier this year, Mark Ormerod, of course, the author of Henry III. Sorry, the author of Edward III. I first met Chris actually in 1996 out in Quebec, of all places, and where we were for a conference on the English Chancery. I don't know why I said all places, but out in Quebec. And I met him. I never knew him very well, but I met him over the years after that. And what I remember particularly about him was his smile and his infectious chuckle. And you've just felt this is a really nice man. And when I told Yale that he died, that really very upset there and said how wonderful it had been working with him on Edward III. And it is a very great book, from the wonderfully alliterative chapter headings down to the detail in which the warfare, politics, and the king's own personality is brought alive. King very different from Henry III, of course. And I remember reading, I think I cite this, at one point in the 1330s, Edward III hosted, I think, just a few years, about 24 tournaments, whereas Henry III, difficult to see ever went to one. We've got actually Mark's Edward III here, and I always love these chapter headings: the scourge of the Scots, family and friends, England's little lion. They go on. Politics and pestilence, Brittany and back. I just wish I could have thought of chapter headings like that, or section headings. I just had not the inspiration to do so. So let me hurry on and get back to the gap between 1990 and 2020. And obviously another obvious question is how different the book would have been if it had come out in the early 1990s. One benefit, I think, of the delay is that I have, of course, far less long to endure finding out that I got things wrong or missed them out. But anyway, sorry, how different would the book have been? I think it would have been different simply because I became more and more familiar with the sources of, say, looking back at them all the time. And I think I got to know Henry and events better. I knew them all better by 2016 than I did in, say, 1990. I also think if it had come out in 1990, which of course was what I intended, I doubt if I would really have digested Bob Stacey's book on politics and finance in the first half of the reign, Hugh Ridgway on the aliens, the revolution of 1258, problems and patronage, or Paul Binsky on Henry's painted chamber. And then in the 1990s, a series of very important books on the reign came out of the period. John Maddicott's Montfort, Nicholas Vincent's Peter de Roche, followed by The Holy Blood, Paul Binsky on Westminster Abbey, and of course Le Goff, as we've seen, on St. Louis. I think the book probably which changed things most was probably Margaret Howell's biography of Eleanor Provence, which I think did show for the first time what a tremendously important part she played in the politics of the reign. And then alongside that, of course, every other year from 1985 and still going is the 13th Century England Conference and its published proceedings. And I was also very lucky to have a wonderful group of research students over the years at King's. Their work is cited in many places in Henry III. So I absolutely don't regret the delay in bringing out Henry III, and I think it's a far, far richer and fuller volume than it would have been if it had come out in the 1990s. I think just one detailed point about that and the work of other historians, which I'm still not really sure about, but in the initial draft, which Michael Clancy read it, but also Michael Presswich read it, and throughout there were sort of references in the main text to other historians, as John Madicott has shown, and so on. And Michael Presswich said, well, I'd leave all those out and put them in the footnotes because he thought it dated a book, and he cited Chris Given Wilson, where he puts all other historians' footnotes, and I think Michael did that in Edward I. I wasn't sure about that, but in the end I took his advice, and so apart from occasional references to Powick, I think one to Jolliffe, all my friends and colleagues who've written about the reign don't get into the main text but are in the footnotes. And that had another consequence because Yale were very concerned about the footnotes just overwhelming everything, and so wanted to make them a bit selective, as actually virtually all the index, worried about the index getting overwhelmed, and the and they wanted to be selective. It is selective, in fact, in all the other English monarchs volumes. And so in the end, actually, we left out of the index what basically is in the footnotes. And so historians don't get into the index either. And I'm sorry about that. Also, I suppose the book doesn't attempt to engage in debate. I think, where I differ both in general interpretation of Henry's rule, but also in points of detail, I just didn't think that was quite what I wanted to do in this book. So the book tells the story of the reign. We might just go back in the last bit to some more images. So the book, as I hope, tells the story of the reign. I hope it brings the king's personality alive, and I hope it brings alive too the wider culture of the reign. If we think about Henry's achievement, here is Henry, by the way, sitting on his throne drawn obviously in this lovely picture by Matthew Paris. And sorry, what did Henry look like? Trevitt, who gives the only physical description of him, says that he was a man of middle height and compact in body, which might perhaps reflect the thickening with age. Trevitt, of course, is writing after Henry's death. Trevitt also says that Henry had one of those sort of sleepy eyelids which dropped down over the pupil. And actually here you can see Matthew Paris in this drawing from the 1250s has given Henry precisely that eye. Here's Henry's tomb in Westminster Abbey, where on the left, where, as you can see, his body must be perfectly preserved because the coffin's never been opened. This is where the coffin is here. And in the 70s, Dean Stanley, my father's predecessor as Dean of Westminster, did have a scheme for opening Henry's tomb, and they took off the effigy and they got down to the coffin. I'm sorry, many of you will know this. But then during the course of the day, the other canons of Westminster got a bit worried about this and contacted Queen Victoria. Sorry, this is merely a story I have from the late librarian of the Abbey, Lawrence Tanner. And Queen Victoria said she was not amused at this idea of opening the coffin of her predecessor. So Stanley was stopped. And he did measure the coffin, which was 6'1.5", and as obviously coffin length is different from body length, Henry perhaps was much the same height as his father, which was 5'6.5". I'm sorry, I've made this joke many times before, but I'll make it again, that I used to be in favour of some sort of using techniques to see what was in the coffin, but then I have written a learned article about showing what Henry was buried in from documentary sources, his crown, sceptre, and so on. So I hope in a way it doesn't happen now, because I might be proved wrong. Sorry, all this is by the way. So let's come back to the reign and Henry and writing about it. I think Henry's two greatest achievements are actually summed up here. So ending on a positive note by the text of Matthew Paris afterwards. And he said, he reigned for a long time in peace. And I think Henry's peace is partly just the nature of his personality, rather than being positively a peacemaker. But, so what? He was easily appeased. He wasn't aggressive. He was a Rex Pacificus, so there was no pressure of trying to fight 100 years earlier, the 100 Years' War. And all of that did lead to this long period of peace, which Paris celebrates here. Multo tempora regnans in pace Anglia. Gubernavit is so I think that that was a great achievement. And I think that in a way, Henry's peace would have continued had it not been for Simon de Montfort. And I just think it's a tragedy. He came back to England in 1263 and created 3 or 4 years of awful civil war. I think I would have supported the revolution of 1258. I'd been like Hugh Bigod, the Justiciar, probably. But I would never have supported Montfort's return in 1263 and the civil war he created. The other great achievement, also written here, is the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey and the splendid ferretry of here is the Abbey up here, of course. And that is clearly Henry's greatest legacy today. So, so the book, I think, tries to tell the story of the reign in a new way, in a new detail. It tries to bring Henry's personality alive, and that's weaved throughout the reign. So I definitely didn't want to hive off building, piety, all the patronage of paupers and so on, just into a separate chapter. I wanted to weave those through. And of course, they did affect virtually everything. So, you know, if you take the folly of the Sicilian business, which did more than anything else to bring Henry down, you know, that's so linked to his piety, because having signed up to this absurd deal with the Pope, I remember Nicholas Vincent telling me that when he looked at looked at the original in the archives in Rome, his sort of eyes almost fell out of his head at its stupidity. I had rather the same feeling when I followed him there and looked at it. You know, when on the day he'd signed up, what does he do but make a stupendous offer to the shrine of the Confessor in the Abbey? Here it, have we got it here? Hold on, I think we can go back and see it again. Although, of course, this was not the shrine then in place, so that the Confessor would bring a happy end to the Sicilian project. Well, I ask you. But that, in a way, it's so illuminating as to how different Henry's outlook is, I think, probably from most medieval kings, and certainly all modern English politicians. So I hope the book tells the story of the reign in a new detail. It brings Henry alive. And I think, although I said I weave the personality into it, I think the two thematic chapters, one on Henry's piety, which I think does throw light on the wider religion of the age, Henry's piety, and also the chapter on his court, which I think is lot about the physical environment, the palaces in which he lived, which are so integral also to his sense of kingship. And sorry, that's one thing I haven't brought out in this, that both the chancery rolls, the coinage, and the letters on the chancery roll, the coinage, and all the wonderful building of the palaces and the abbey are all about the visual side of Henry's kingship, if you like, non-verbal communication, and the way Henry hoped that this wonderful visual rhetoric would help him get his way. Well, it did, and it didn't. It didn't stop, of course, the revolution of 1258 or a civil war. But in the end, I think, you know, it did help him survive. It did mean that there was no effort to depose him, and all the good things he'd done, the building of the Abbey, his evident piety, I think did in the end save his monarchy. So I mustn't ramble on. Finally, back to Philip Larkin in a way, or in a modified form to Philip Larkin. What I've written, Henry III, is what I had to write or could write, given my personality, background, training, faced with the wonderful sources for the reign of Henry III. Thank you very much for listening.